I'm David Force from Faronel, and in this video I'm going to be talking a little bit about the repertoire that we play from England for crumhorns. The crumhorn was a very popular instrument in Germanic-speaking countries in the 16th century and also in Italy, but there were only two places we know that it was played in Britain during that time. Both of them were associated with the court of Henry VIII. One was at Whitehall Palace in London, and the other was at Henry's Palace at Nonsuch in Surrey. But Henry certainly seems to have been keen on these instruments, because when he died, the inventory of his possessions included 18 crumhorns. The crumhorn is curious in that there are only a small handful of pieces that we can be sure were specifically written for it. So what did crumhornists play apart from these? Well, the repertoire fell into two camps. One were transcriptions or arrangements of popular dance melodies of the time written in a homophonic style. And the other camp were vocal works, usually secular polyphonic vocal works that were arranged for the crumhorn. So where do we get then our English crumhorn music? Well, to answer that question, we actually have to jump ahead for a few moments into the 17th century. And look at the way in which organs were used in viol consort music. In the 17th century, small consort or chamber organs were played alongside viols in consorts, and the organists would have had three distinct types of music put before them to create their part in the ensemble. The first type doesn't really concern us, but it was just an unfigured bass. The second type was a simple texture of treble and bass, and the organist was expected to create inner parts to fill out the texture. But the rest of this music would have been improvised polyphonically on the spot. And the third kind of source that organists would have used were scores. These came in two types. You could either have the open score, familiar to us today, where each instrument has its own line, and then there was the condensed score, where all the instrumental parts were crammed onto two staves. Most instrumental and vocal music at this time was written on 5-line staves, but keyboard music used 6 lines. But to make life easier for these consort organists, the condensed scores were written also on 6-line staves. So very often you come across a piece of music that is on 6 lines, and people just assume therefore that it is a piece of solo organ music. But of course we now realise that many of these pieces are in fact condensed scores for use in consort. So to get our 16th century crumhorn music, we extrapolate back and we look for sources of keyboard music, often on 6 lines, that might be suitable for use on crumhorns. So the first example we're going to look at is housed in the British Library. This is Royal Appendix 58. This was produced by a musician who was clearly active at the court of Henry during his lifetime. It consists of a mixture of vocal works, mass settings, secular songs, but there are also some pieces that appear to be keyboard works, mostly with a 3-part texture. And whilst these look as if they are keyboard pieces, and indeed they actually can be played as standalone keyboard pieces, what they more probably are actually condensed scores of consort music. And if you look a little bit more closely at this one, you can see that the music falls into 3 distinct strands that we can separate out and recreate the original instrumental parts. Fall very comfortably under the fingers on the crumhorn, which of course doesn't prove that they were crumhorn pieces, but it certainly opens the possibility that they might have been, given the connection with the court of Henry VIII. Another one that we use quite a lot in Faronel is the Mulliner book. This is an organ book that was compiled by Thomas Mulliner, starting off at about 1540 and working through to about 1570. Mulliner is thought, although we can't be absolutely certain, to have been tutor to the choristers at St Paul's Cathedral during the 1540s, and it's these earlier works that we're particularly interested in. Some of them, again, are clearly condensed scores. So in this example, what looks like a rather complicated piece of music is a piece of 3-part viol music. So the 3 individual viol parts are condensed onto one stave. And you can see, if you look carefully at the beginning, there are in fact 3 clefs that show the ranges of the 3 original parts. We also find in the Mulliner book examples of that treble and bass texture that we find in the 17th century organ sources. There are several jolly dances with continental titles of this type in the early part of the book. And the idea here would have been, just like the later 17th century examples, that the organist would have been expected to add inner parts. So here we've added a 3rd part for a tenor instrument. And again, these pieces actually fall under the hands very nicely on crumhorns. So that's a little taster of how we acquire our English crumhorn music.